Our next speaker is one of the research leaders here at the QUT Faculty of Law in terms of our work on 3D printing regulation law. Dr. Angela Daly is already the author of a leading text on 3D printing regulation. A comparative lawyer by training, she's now diversifying her research and having a think about 3D printing in Southeast Asia, including some of her emerging work on 3D printing in China.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks very much to the other speakers as well. It was really great to hear some other perspectives from different industries and different academic disciplines too. So I'm going to talk very briefly, in fact, because I'm very aware of the time rapidly being eaten up by the great presentation so far. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of my current work looking at 3D printing and intellectual property in China. And just to kind of begin, this is part of a bigger project that Matthew mentioned at the very beginning, which is funded by the United Kingdom Intellectual Property Office and is really looking at what's happening with 3D printing in various different parts of the world and what effect is that having on intellectual property law and policy, and what might it have in the future as well. So we have an interdisciplinary and international team which I am leading, which is doing this work, and we're almost halfway through. So we've been doing some kind of preparatory work so far in terms of kind of literature reviews, but we were about to commence doing field work in various different locations, including China. So what I'm presenting today is really some background work that we've done in the lead up to the field work that we're going to be doing in Shenzhen in China, which is kind of the tech manufacturing hub of China and therefore in some respects of the world, in a few weeks' time. But my work previous to this was really concentrated on Western approaches to 3D printing and intellectual property. This slide I'm not going to explain because I don't have enough time, but this would give you an idea of what the kind of 3D printing ecosystem or industry looks like in the West, by which I mean the US, Western Europe, and Australia to some extent as well. And you may recognise some of the companies, particularly MakerBot, Thingiverse, there. My previous research really looked at 3D printing in the US, the UK, Western Europe and Australia, focusing on the legal frameworks in these countries, including intellectual property. Now, while there's been a lot of discussion about the disruptive potential of 3D printing on society, industry, and also the legal system or legal frameworks, because of the fact that we haven't seen a huge take-up of 3D printing among consumers or prosumers in particular, this is placing a limit on how disruptive 3D printing is at the moment in Western societies. And while not discounting that the future might bring more widespread take-up of 3D printing and more disruption, we're not quite in that situation yet, at least in the West anyway. However, my focus until now has very much been on kind of Western jurisdictions and Western kind of views of 3D printing, and that's actually very reflective of a lot of the literature which currently exists in academia and also probably kind of industry and policy-oriented literature, at least in the English language. But this is despite the fact that 3D printing may have very different trajectories in non-Western and non-English speaking parts of the world, and may have kind of more impact, in fact, in some of these places compared to in the developed economies of North America, Europe, and so on. And this has also been recognised by the World Intellectual Property Organization in a recent report as well, which did note that 3D printing may have a different trajectory in developing economies and also in remote areas even of developed economies. So Australia would be one sort of place where that may be the case. Many remote areas here where 3D printing may be actually more useful than it is in the city. I'm going to talk a bit about China now because that's the part of the project that I have been working on quite a bit, and I'd like to acknowledge my research assistant Jiaji Lu, almost Dr. Jiaji Lu, who's just about to graduate or about to complete his PhD at the QUT Digital Media Research Centre, but has now moved back to Shenzhen, actually, where he comes from, to take up a post at Dongguan University. Anyway, I just want to acknowledge him. He can't be with us, but he's really helped me a lot in understanding this, what's happening with 3D printing in China. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that China is increasingly becoming the world's dominant manufacturing nation, but that's manufacturing using various different methods, and 3D printing is growing in China as it is in many parts of the world as well. Again, from that WIPO report, there was some very interesting statistics coming out about China intellectual property and 3D printing. It's the only middle income country coming close to the advanced industrializations with regards to the filings of patents in the 3D printing sphere, many of which have been filed by public institutions in China. And as you can see from that graphic, there's actually, maybe it's a bit difficult to see, but the first column is patent filings between 1995 and 2001. The second column is filings between 2005 and 2011. And as you can see with China, not a lot of filings in that earlier period, a huge amount, and in fact the world leader, in fact, in the more recent period. So what we have done in preparation for the fieldwork in China is conduct a literature review of literature and IP in 3D printing. We found almost nothing in the English language, but we did find quite a bit in Chinese, and actually, very interestingly, very similar themes about infringement, intellectual property exceptions, and enforcement emerge as we see in the West, which is interesting in the sense that China has had a reputation of being a kind of big infringing country of others' IP, while now is transitioning to a country which is creating more of its own intellectual property, and perhaps as a result of that, these kind of similar concerns are emerging with regards to intellectual property and 3D printing there as in the West. And just to kind of give some context as well, the Chinese government's Made in China 2025 program includes the promotion and implementation of 3D printing technologies in China. There's a lot of money and policy going into that, which is definitely contributing to the growth of 3D printing in China as well. Just very kind of briefly, I mean, as I kind of mentioned in the abstract to this presentation, as many of you might be aware, there's a kind of parallel internet ecosystem in China. So the services that people in countries like Australia use, like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and even to some extent Apple, sometimes known as GAFA. In China, there is BAT instead, which is Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. So we kind of have this sort of parallel internet ecosystem in China for various reasons, one of which is probably linguistic, also around kind of government regulation in China as well, and kind of, I suppose, cultural specificities too. So in fact, one of the kind of hypotheses I had, or one of the things I was interested to find out, was whether the same kind of 3D printing platforms and manufacturers that we're familiar with in the West, as I kind of put on that slide about the Western 3D printing ecosystem, are these actually kind of breaking into the Chinese market, or is there also a parallel ecosystem emerging in China? And actually from the research that my assistant Jaji has done, what we are seeing is a parallel system emerging with regards to 3D printing, and at least 3D printing design file sites anyway. So this is one of them called SimpNeed, and the other major one is called Muho. I'm probably not pronouncing those very well. My Mandarin classes have only just started. However, these are two sites which are used for 3D printed design files. They're probably most comparable to Shapeways in the Western world compared to rather than Thingiverse, because people they're uploading files but not downloading files, or they're requesting products to be made centrally by these companies and then sent to them, so made kind of on demand. But as compared to Shapeways, they're actually much newer, so that, which perhaps suggests that the 3D printing ecosystem in China is a bit newer overall compared to in at least the United States or the Western world kind of more generally. And also we haven't found yet a very prominent platform which would be similar to the Thingiverse model, where people can upload and download files. So the model in China seems to be more similar to Shapeways than Thingiverse. As I mentioned before, China's kind of going from this user of others' IP to a creator of its own intellectual property. And as I also mentioned, in the literature review that we did, we saw some kind of similar themes emerging around infringement, intermediary liability, and exceptions to various different intellectual property rights. And some commentators in the Chinese literature have called for things like more regulation of CAD file platforms, which they view as kind of falling between the gaps in terms of kind of secondary liability for IP infringement. Also, some other commentators have wanted to see the categories of what constitutes infringement broadened as well, particularly in the case of patent law in China, to cover consumers making infringing products, because it's not very clear at the moment whether that constitutes an infringement of Chinese patent law. And that can also be compared to some of the exceptions in Western jurisdictions for kind of private, non-commercial use of patents. So in fact, just to kind of emphasize, very similar themes emerging. And also there is some commentary around the lack of clarity as to the extent to which copyright subsists in design files in Chinese intellectual property law as well. So yes, very similar to the Western discussions too. Just kind of, given this topic of today is on designs law in China, just a kind of very brief introduction to what that actually means and looks like. So the model in China is very similar to the design patents model in the US, so industrial designs being protected within the Chinese patent law. There is no unregistered design protection, but China has still not acceded to the international the WIPO Hague Convention. But we didn't really find very much discussion specifically on design patents and 3D printing in China, some more discussion around patents more generally, but I don't know to what extent this actually mirrors some of the discussion in Western jurisdictions around designs. As Mitchell mentioned, they're kind of an unloved area of intellectual property. There is an idea that they might become more important in the context of 3D printing, but that was actually going to be one of my questions to Mitchell, was whether he thought or you think that they are in fact becoming more important in practice, because I just see a lot of kind of academic debate around that, and that would seem to be reflected, or there's not even that debate necessarily happening in China, which suggests that they're possibly not an important area of protection in practice. So just to kind of conclude on that very kind of brief summary of the work that we're doing in China, definitely kind of a lot of similarities with regards to 3D printing production and IP concerns between China and the West, at least in terms of the academic literature. And also, I mean, this kind of government policy in China is very similar to what other governments in Western countries and also in non-Western countries. So the Indian government also has a major policy which around, I think it's also called imaginatively Make in India, and so that also includes government support for the development of additive manufacturing and 3D printing there. So in fact, there's a lot of similarities. Every country, or every large country interested in 3D printing seems to have a government policy around that. So to what extent those will be successful or not will be very interesting to see. But I think it's important to recognise that there are still very different local conditions, and I think China is one place where that's going to be quite, at least in the countries that we're looking at in this project, that the language and technology ecosystem, some of which, as I kind of mentioned before, would be a kind of development from the internet ecosystem, which is still very different to the West. So different companies, different platforms, and possibly also different practices as well emerging. So really this is a kind of background to the kind of field work that we're doing in these various locations over the next couple of months. So I'm going to be doing field work specifically in Singapore and Shenzhen, and colleagues doing field work in Delhi, London, and probably the Netherlands as well. And so this will hopefully give us some more insight into how 3D printing is developing in different countries by consulting with experts involved in 3D printing ecosystems. So from industry segments across policymakers, lawyers, academics, and makers as well in all these kind of different locations. So to try and understand how 3D printing is developing there, how the development of 3D printing may or may not be interacting with intellectual property systems, and to try and understand what potential future scenarios may be in those countries or for 3D printing more globally, and what regulatory and policy responses might be useful with that information in hand. Okay, so that's it from me. I hope we will have a lot more to talk about in about 6 months' time once we've actually done that work, and we'll hopefully be able to come back and give some information and some of about our findings, really, to give a better idea of what actually is happening.